this talk is called "We Need to Talk About Livestock" in the same sort of tenor as "We Need to Talk About Kevin," which you might have heard of. And I'm going to start with a very quick quiz, just to get you in the mood. A fiver for the correct answer, but you're only allowed up to 10, only for the first one, by the way. And you're only allowed up to 10 guesses for this. Which country on earth has the most cattle?
Argentina?
India.
Brazil.
We have the right answer here, Tash. That wasn't a planted question, planted answer at all. It's India, which is...
It's the biggest dairy producer in the world, isn't it?
Sorry?
It produces more dairy than any other country as well, doesn't it?
I don't know.
I think it is.
Which is very surprising because you'd think it would be Brazil, which is in fact second, and then Argentina and the USA are sort of third equal. But India has the most cattle, and they don't even eat cattle. I mean, or at least not many of them do. Hindus don't eat cattle. So are cattle numbers in the in Britain and Europe and the world? Well, let's start with the world. Are cattle numbers in the world increasing or decreasing?
Increasing?
They are decreasing. They have been decreasing since a high in 1989, and they are back to about the same as they were in 1975. So the sort of trope that you hear that the world has an ever increasing demand for beef. To be fair, beef production has increased in that period, but from fewer cattle. So the number of cattle in the world is actually declining. This is sort of difficult for all of you to answer at once, but do you know what the biggest source of methane emissions are on the planet? Who knows what the first one is? It depends how you categorise this, actually, so it's a little bit...
Melting cows.
No.
Tundra? Is it the tundra? Permafrost melting?
Well, I've slightly had to... Depends how you categorise these. So, sorry? So I tell you what, I've categorised them as natural, or fossil fuels, or rice cultivation, livestock and waste. So out of those, do you know which is first?
Waste.
No, so natural is first with 40% of total methane emissions. A great deal of that comes from termites, and some comes from peat bogs and wetlands and methane clathrates and things like that. And then second, yes.
I get money.
Sorry? It's 40% natural, 21% fossil fuels. Third is livestock at 19%, which includes all livestock activities, and then waste, and then rice at 5%. Although there is dispute about this. Actually, these figures are not nearly as. Although those are figures from UNEP, they're not nearly as solid as they look. And in fact, recent research suggests that rice might be higher, up to twice as much as cattle. But I haven't been able to confirm that because it's not confirmed. Yes, sorry, we just need that one. So there's a picture that you will probably mostly recognise. Is there too much light for that screen?
Yeah,
We should
you
switch
can
them
be
on.
plunged into darkness if you like. And it'll be, let's try it and we'll just... I can, yeah.
Now you're a silhouette.
Can you not have any light on over there with this off?
It's out there, so it's this.
Do a show of hands for like.
Shall I just take this one out?
Yeah, take the bulb out.
Does that help? Even at the opposite way round?
Electrician.
There we are.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Can you read?
That's fine anyway, Jen. For us.
Yeah.
Can I read it? I don't know. We'll see. So that was that was one of my questions. Is there are two kinds of habitat here. You all know where this is. This looks like it's been. I don't know when this was taken, but it looks like that's been either mown and then grazed or something, and then behind it some woodland. Which part of that is holding the most carbon, including above ground and below ground carbon? Yes, thank you. Surprisingly, the grassland was Well, actually, I'm guessing but on basic principles, we would assume the grassland, which is ancient grassland on a floodplain, is holding a lot more carbon than the woodland, including the trees. And the second part of that is which one sequesters more carbon into the soil every year. It's the grass again. Well done. And the last one is only a bit of a joke, and I haven't got my props. I was meant to have a litre of organic milk. Well, sorry, that is a pint of milk, that'll do. And then a bottle of Oakley. And I wanted to ask, do you know, so organic milk is about £1 a litre for in Waitrose. How much of that, what was the farmer paid for that?
What was the farmer paid for it?
For that litre?
5p.
Well, actually about 50. I meant to check with my friend who's in the milk industry, but it's between 40 and 50 anyway. So they're only marking up the milk by 100%, which is actually quite a small margin, really. The Oakley at the back there, do you know what the farmer was paid? So a litre of Oakley is £2.50, 2.5 times as much. Do you know what the farmer was paid for the ingredients in the Oakley?
20p.
1 penny.
No.
1 penny. It's got 10 grams of oats. Oats are £100 a tonne, actually 120, so 1.2 pence. And there are no other ingredients. So that wasn't really part of my talk, that one. I just thought I'd make that point. That if you buy Oakley milk, you are being robbed for no nutritional benefit, because that's a 25,000% markup. I think I worked that out.
But you are getting some glyphosate on the oats.
So why livestock? Well, apart from the fact I'm a livestock farmer, but why do I need to talk about livestock? Livestock are part of land use, and land use is the most important thing we do every day. And livestock are a huge part of global land use. Indeed, the accusation is they are too large a part. I'm just going to flick through some photos and to show. Well, first of all, this is what I do. So I have a suckler herd. There they are, of certified pasture-fed suckler herd, which means cows that rear their own calf. They're served naturally by a bull, and there are no inputs. So in their whole year, they only have grass and pasture and hay, not grass, but pasture. And they don't have any supplementary feed, no vaccines, no wormers, no routine drugs, no other treatments of any kind in their life. So it's as natural as a livestock system can be. And they do rotational grazing, so we'll come on to that. So there's just a few pics of them.
James, can I ask what's the difference between grass and pasture? What's the difference between grass and pasture?
I missed who asked that.
Me, Andrew.
Oh, sorry, Andrew. Well, grass is just one set of species, grassland species, and pasture includes masses of dicotyledons, flowers or herbs they're called. So pasture is, and actually on some farms all the cows get is grass, literally grass, because the pasture is just grass. Yeah. If it's a lay and it's nitrogenised, it will just be ryegrass, which is basically like eating porridge for your whole life and nothing else. Whereas my cows, I mean, there are 200 species in this field, there are 150 in Beck-Tithe, and there are hundreds of other species in their grassland and in their hay. So that's the difference. We sometimes use grass as a shorthand, but really we mean pasture. There's one of the hay meadows in flower. I'm just going to flick through some other pictures which show. You will see the point of this. This might seem a bit disjointed, but you will see the point of this at some point. Which shows some other kinds of land use, and some are livestock and some are plants. Can you all see what that is? this is really just to show that world land use is a hugely diverse. There we go, and there's one that we can all recognise. World land use is hugely diverse, and you can't. Although I'm trying to compress some very simple arguments into half an hour or so, actually world land use doesn't really work like that. But then the accusations that are being made about livestock are themselves very oversimplified, and this is to show that actually world land use, both crop and animal land use, is extremely diverse. So, and what I'm talking about today is really a defence of livestock farming. That doesn't mean I'm defending all livestock farming, it's a generalised defence. And by the way, do ask questions on the way if you have a sort of burning question. I'm just going to go back through those and say each one that has livestock is bad and each one with plant husbandry is good, because that's what we're talking about. So that's good, clearly. Very, very good, in fact, it couldn't get better. That's organic crop husbandry. I'm not going, oh sorry, wrong way. Definitely wrong way. Good. Good. No, I'm still pressing the same button. Good. This has got stuck. Let's try going, no, let's try going to
You
a
might have
different
to go
button.
right the way back to the beginning of where you want to go to.
Bad, bad, good. Peasant woman with, these were meant to play the other way round, but so peasant woman with her crops, good. Peasant woman with her llama, bad. Good, good, good. Peasant woman with chickens, bad. Peasant woman with her crops, good. Orchard with sheep, bad. Orchard without sheep, good. Good, 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 bad. In fact, very bad. Good, bad, good, bad. And all the rest are bad. Okay? I'm sort of putting my heart on my sleeve straight away. Let me just see where I'm supposed to be going with that. So, I've got one other little disjointed bit. Imagine, so it's a little parable. Imagine that you are, so how many of you have a bicycle? Almost everybody has a bicycle. So it's the year 2030 and you are cycling along innocently, minding your own business and going down to the shops. And you reach a roadblock, and it's a police roadblock, and they say, "Excuse me, sir," or "Madam," whichever you are, you can't go any further because we're not allowing bicycles anymore." And you say, what are you talking about? What? You can't, not allowing bicycles? What is this? And he says, "Oh, I'm sorry, sir, this is a new rule. All wheeled vehicles are banned." And you say, "Well, this is just ridiculous. I mean, I'm not doing any harm with my bicycle. It's preposterous." He says, "I'm sorry, that's the new law. Go back home." And so sadly, you hand over your bicycle and you go back home and you look it up and you discover that the government has made a law that all wheeled vehicles are to be taken off the road. There are to be no wheeled vehicles at all. What they've done is they've averaged all the buses and lorries and cars and trains and bicycles into one huge package. They've decided that wheeled vehicles are destroying the planet, and so they're going to remove them all, including the bicycles. So what I'm going to ask you tonight is, at the end of this, is which of the livestock are the lorries and which are the, because we're told that all livestock are destroying the planet. Which ones are the lorries and which ones are the bicycles? I hope that made sense. It seemed a bit laboured, but I was interested in this question until about 2014. I was minding my own business, running my farm, and then I was involved in environmental things, and I'd never heard of footprinting of farming. And then in 2014, I was quite excited to read this. I heard about this thing, Food Printing Oxford, an attempt to measure the footprint, they cleverly called it food printing, but the footprint of the food supply for Oxford. And I read this with great interest, thinking this looked like a sort of interesting exercise. And when I read it, I was astonished, because it said that my cattle were destroying the planet. It was pretty clear about this. Actually, it's not quite as clear as they then put into the summary, but anyway, they said it was destroying the planet. So then this sounds like I didn't really have a life, but I then spent a year analysing this document, a year of evenings basically, hundreds of hours analysing this document. And what I found destroyed my faith in, not so much in science, but in the usage that science could be put to. Sorry, I sometimes get slightly lost, and I may have to go to my own notes. Because I wrote it better further ago. So what I discovered shook my world, not because they had proved that my meat production was damaging, far from it, but because I learned that science, or at least the reportage and usage of science, cannot be trusted. The entire report was junk masquerading as science, and I learned a depressing lesson that any combination, this is going to pop up a couple more times, so I'm going to write it down for you. This is my little handy acronym for what is going on in the world of land use in relation to cattle farming. And I used to think this only applied to journalism, but I now think this acronym applies to within the science world as well, which has been a very hard lesson to learn. And that is that it is subject to bias, laziness, ignorance, and sheer stupidity. 5 things, and this will crop up again. So it's a bit childish of me, but that really does summarise a lot of the literature, both in the scientific world and in general things. There's a whole story about what happens in academia to do. It's called an auto feedback or something. Do you know about this? Where once something has been said once, people just copy it, and then they never go back to the original to try and understand it. They just copy it. And I'm coming to a very dramatic example of that. Sorry about this. So since the Oxford Food Printing Report, we now, if you read anything at all, or if you watch any telly, you will have seen there's a tsunami of anti-livestock rhetoric. I mean, you can choose your own word: tidal wave, a hurricane, or so on. So just to give some examples, what do all these people have in common? David Attenborough, Chris Packham, George Monbiot, Greta Thunberg, Lewis Hamilton, Bill Gates, Dale Vince, Extinction Rebellion, New Scientist and all its writers, The Guardian and all its writers, all your teenage children, and almost every celebrity. They're all agreed on one thing: to save the planet, you must first become a vegan. One of them actually said, "Go vegan, it is the only way to truly save the planet today." And just to amuse you, wrong way, the one who said that is his work vehicle, and that is his private transport. But he's saying that to save the planet you have to go vegan. So that is obviously Lewis Hamilton. That's not his actual one, but it's the same model. And those of us, and the reason this matters is because it's affecting the real world. It's not just an opinion. I have no objection to people being vegans individually whatsoever, what I'm objecting to is the use of very poor science to promote what is effectively going to be a change in land use, which I see as detrimental. Recent examples are that, for example, Greener Henley, which is a group like PAWS, a sustainability group, have got a food group, and their food group has started a campaign, and the campaign is to persuade everybody to become vegan. So they're going to go into schools and universities and so on. So that's what I would call fundamentalist veganism, or I don't want to go too far, but I call it militant veganism. This is trying to promote the idea that you must be vegan, which is so there's a lot of pressure on universities and councils and so on from a minority of very active vegans trying to persuade, for example, universities. Oxfordshire County Council, for example, has decided to not serve any meat in any of its meals ever again. I mean, it doesn't have many meals, but that's its principle. There's also a thing which has come up, just come up to me as a councillor, which has been sent to all of us, called the Plant-Based Treaty, which you may have come across. I think we have, there it is, which is the most fundamentalist, this is only a tiny part of it. And they're asking us to sign this, and some of my fellow councillors who are minded this way, or just assume that we all have to eat less meat, have happily signed up for it, I think without really understanding it. And I've asked for a chance to present what would effectively be this talk, but as a written document to them. It's very extreme, as you can see. So no building of new animal farms, no expansion or intensification of existing farms. So it would mean that no conversion of plant-based agriculture to animal agriculture. So if you're running a rotational system, are you not allowed to go back into grass when you've had a crop in the field or whatever? I don't really know. Anyway, those are the sort of examples of what we're facing. Those of us who rear ruminants on, and I have to find my right page now. Those of us who rear ruminants in very natural ways, as I do, on pasture, face a torrent of the greatest criticism in both scientific and non-scientific media. Our activities are said to be literally destroying the planet. But in case you think that I'm just a lone voice against this, crying in the wilderness, I know I'm connected to hundreds, I know hundreds, and I'm connected to thousands of people who think this is wrong. That in fact, not just wrong, but in fact the opposite is true. That to save the world, we need to use animals as long as they're the right animals in the right way on the right land. And these include, I'm trying to paint a picture where, although veganism has taken the moral high ground, it's actually not very widely supported. So an example of this is that there is something called the Dublin Declaration. It's actually only supported, I believe, by a relatively small number of scientists, even though their work has been sort of expanded all over the world and by others. But actually they're a relatively small group, mostly at Oxford, in fact. Sorry, you can't read it because I couldn't get it to print in a way that you'd be able to read. That's the Dublin Declaration, which has been signed by over 1,000 scientists, basically saying that the demonisation of livestock is not appropriate, is not scientific, and is not justified, and that we need livestock. So if you're interested in that, do look that up. And the vegan agenda is also not supported, and this is in a way more significant, by any nature conservation organisations, any organic organisations, apart from the Vegan Organic Network, naturally, any agroecological or regenerative or food sovereignty or peasant or development or indeed farming organisations of any kind anywhere in the world, as far as I'm aware. So, and just for illustration, that the plant life a charity that you may know of, have made a call for a grassland action plan. They've identified that grassland is the most neglected habitat, as in politically neglected, and so they've got this grassland action plan. Grassland makes up 40% of England and more like 60 or 70% of the whole of the United Kingdom, I think, something like that. And you'll see that this is a call for grassland action plan, and being grassland, naturally, that implies animals, and that has lots of support, as you can see, from all kinds of nature conservation charities, also the Soul Association, and so on and so on, Friends of the Earth, and so on. So who? I may not need this bit actually. Who is this very successful agenda? The successful agenda of the vegan agenda driven by? I think it's a bit like a hierarchical structure. Unfortunately, it has the IPCC, which has enormous authority. I'm going to come on to this in a minute. In a minute, we're going to have some real science, and which is really the meat of this. The IPCC made some errors in their methodologies 30 years ago, and some of the science is justified in following that. But you can see when we get onto that whether they should have done that, and also whether it should be followed now. And then there are a few scientists, extremely ones very good at publicity, nearly all at the Oxford Martin School for the Future of Food, which is part of Oxford University. People like Joseph Paul, of a famous paper, Paul and Nemetschek 2018, which is an absolutely devastating critique of livestock husbandry, but is all based on one piece of science which we believe to be incorrect. The paper says the same thing in 60 different ways on 60 different pages, but it's all based on one piece of science. And then lots of journalists, both science journalists and general celebrities, and a large number of committed vegan foot soldiers such as students, councillors and so on. Right. So we've already seen that. So that was a little bit about the motives of people that we've already seen, but we may refer to that again. So this is what we're really talking about. The case for the prosecution. Meat production in general, but especially ruminant husbandry, uses too much of the world's water, too much of the world's land, destroys precious habitats such as tropical forests, and the big one, methane. I need some tea. I'm going to start with water because this one is so funny and so ludicrous that it will destroy your faith in science and make it easier to persuade you about the other ones. So in every single criticism of livestock husbandry, you will read the same figure, that it takes 15,000 tonnes of water to produce a tonne of beef, or 15,000 litres of water to produce a kilogram of beef. You see this universally, and I have seen a BBC interviewer attacking a farmer and saying, your beef is using 15,000 tonnes to produce 1 tonne of beef. And he's saying, I don't think it does. And she says, yes it is, I've read it. Which is the level of understanding that you expect from journalists. I've read it, and so it must be true. So there's the 15,000. It doesn't really matter whether it's litres or, anyway, it's 15,000 times as much. So this is clearly not very well scaled, but 0.5% of that is what the cattle drink. Okay? 0.1%, which is about the black line, is what's used in the abattoir. What do you think the rest is?
Like to
Right.
wash waste facilities and get rid of the
No,
slurry.
I've counted that in
Oh,
the,
that's okay.
yeah.
Is
Is it to grow feed?
Grass, rain for grass.
It's rain for grass. It's rain. 99% of this figure is rain. And so I'm going to write someone's name. Arjun Y. Hoekstra, a Dutch hydrologist, invented the science of water footprinting, all on his own. And it's now been adopted by every hydrological society on Earth. And he decided that his methodology would put an opportunity cost for water. So basically, what he's really saying is, and this is clear from his, when I saw this figure, which is in the Oxford Food Printing Report, about 15,000 tonnes, they're saying it takes the River Thames flowing for 9 months of the year through Oxford to provide the water for Oxford food supply, which actually equates exactly to the amount of rainfall on Oxfordshire in that time. He decided that he would say he didn't say they use this water, he said it was the water footprint. And he decided that the footprint would include rainfall falling on the land that those cattle were standing on. Now clearly, that water will fall on that land and go its own way, whether my cattle are standing there or not. But what people have done, and what journalists do, is they just look it up. They just look it up, and you can find it anywhere. You can find that the water footprint of beef is 15,000 times, 15,000 times the amount of beef.
So James, why is that not? So is that you're saying that the fact that it's can that water be used in another way on the land that's there for livestock?
So what he actually did was he said there are three kinds of water in his water footprint is quite cleverly constructed. He says that everything uses three kinds of water, or can use three kinds of water. Green water, which is rain, which just falls and does its own thing. Blue water, which means it's been piped and is part of the water supply. And grey water, which is water, which is wastewater, which has to be cleaned and treated and so on. So what he was effectively saying was you could be using this land for something else, so there's an opportunity cost of this water. But this is preposterous. I mean, this means that, so I worked out that the water footprint of an oak tree in the woods over there would be hundreds of thousands of tonnes per tonne of oak, because it stood there for hundreds of years with the rain falling on it. It's completely preposterous. And I worked out that a couple of sheep on a distant moorland have a water footprint of about 500,000 tonnes per tonne of sheep. And if you are into grouse shooting, a tonne of grouse would have a water footprint of 3 million tonnes per tonne of grouse. So clearly, it's meaningless. So never again accept when people say, oh, beef production uses a huge amount of water.
Are you saying that's meaningless because other things are happening at the same time as the animal feeding of it, or the oak growing, or the grouse existing? Or in what sense is it meaningless?
I'm saying that in no sense have my cattle used or impacted on that water. In no sense at all. Yes, Tash?
Does this figure, is that specifically for grass-fed and pasture-fed cattle? Because what about cattle that are kept inside and they're fed on feed that's grown on vast amounts of land, and that water might be irrigated onto that land? So that's a different way of using water, and that's slightly less meaningless.
That's perfectly true. But I don't know any cattle anywhere in the world, or livestock. I don't know of any system in the world that uses irrigation water to produce animal feed.
Okay.
It's possible that they do in some parts of the world, in which case their water footprint would be a bit higher.
I suppose the argument then is slightly less meaningless though, because then the water that falls on that land that is being fed to the feed that's growing the feed that's fed to the cattle could be growing something
could be
else.
used for something else. That's right. But in fact, his own figures say This is his paper on this particular subject, the hidden water resource use behind meat and dairy, and he writes that in industrialised countries, moving towards, I mean, among other things, moving towards a vegetarian diet can reduce the food-related water footprint of people by 36%. And he goes on about how we need to reduce the water footprint of meat and dairy. But he knew that that was nonsense, because he developed it. So he knew he was talking bollocks. And so there isn't any other way of describing this particular piece of science as utter bollocks. It really is.
I guess the fact is that an awful lot of that, in the context of Parkfield here, will end up in the river, will fade into the river and flow down to London and out to sea. So it's clearly not being used by the cattle. You know, because it's not all going to be absorbed by the grasslands which feeds the cattle.
Clearly not.
A lot of it will completely
Now,
bypass.
just to put this in another numerical context, 1/3 tonnes of rain falls on my farm in a year. 330,000 tonnes. My cattle drink 3,000 tonnes. So they drink just about 1% of the water that falls on my farm. So, which is just about what we see here. So the other 99% goes the same way. We can't spend too long on that because we've got to deal with methane. But I think that's pretty.
Surely that's going to go to pasture though. Right?
Sorry?
Is all of that, lots of that water that's falling on the farm is going to go to pasture.
Yes.
The cattle and then eat it.
Well, that's his point.
Isn't that the equal?
But that pasture is a good habitat for insects.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is the argument it's doing other things, or is the argument that you could I don't really follow.
His argument is what you say, that it's used that water. It actually hasn't used all of it by any means, but it's used some of that water to grow that pasture. My question is, so what? What the hell? I
Do
mean,
we know what percentage? 1% is drinking for cattle.
yeah.
A certain percentage then is for the growth of the plants. So it should be possible to have another line somewhere between the bottom and the top, showing where the water for the plants.
Imagine all the grasslands are concrete, the water runs straight into the Thames and you're gone.
Yeah.
Flood everywhere.
Yeah.
But feeding the pasture is
The
beneficial.
point is, so he's arguing that we should eat. By the way, in this particular paper, he argues that we should eat wheat. He compares wheat and beef. He says wheat only uses 5,000 tonnes per tonne of wheat, but he's doing the same thing. It's just the water that falls on the wheat. It's a completely meaningless comparison. It has no meaning in the real world, to my. You could argue about. I'll ask you. Sorry, I'll come in a minute. But you could argue about how we should be using land for different things. That's a land use argument. But I don't think you can argue that on the basis of the water which falls naturally on that land. You could argue that we'll come on to land use as in tensions between different land uses.
Yeah, it's going to be a little bit more towards land use, but because you were saying there's a lot of support there for like the grassland, and how like 40% of the UK is grassland, and obviously all this water's going into grassland, and somebody mentioned there that there was lots of habitat there, but would there not be an alternative use that would support more life in grassland? Because I know you said that grassland was possibly better than woodland at one point. Yeah. But I mean, in general, for.
I will just cover that just at the end about tensions between different land uses, because one of the things, because it uses too much of the world's land. I was actually going to come to that last because it's, in a way, it's a summary of the other ones. How much time have I used?
It's 8:20, but there's plenty of time. Keep going. Don't worry about it. If people start falling asleep, then we'll just escort them.
Sorry?
People
Right,
start-
methane. So this is the big one, because we all know, you read every day that cattle are destroying the world because of their methane. And sorry, I was going to make a joke before that actually these three I can demolish in 5 minutes each. Actually, that took a lot longer for the water, but it was supposed to only take 5 minutes, but you're a difficult audience. But this one I say takes 15 minutes, but you do have to concentrate. So, sorry, let's do one thing at a time. Right, I don't know if you can see that, it's a bit small. It's a diagram, a very nice diagram of the carbon cycle. By the way, just to start on this, the figures that are given for the amount of climate change that cattle are responsible for are grossly exaggerated in most literature. What they actually have been reduced to now, they were massively overestimated quite some time ago, and people are still quoting very outdated figures like livestock are responsible for 30% of all climate change and so on. The actual official figure is that the methane from livestock is responsible for 4% of climate change, 4% of the total CO2 equivalent of climate change. That's the official figure. However, I'm going to dispute that. I'm going to dispute it on the basis of scientists who've said so. So I'm only quoting scientists. There are three different ways of explaining this, and they're all basically saying the same thing, but it's useful to use all three because different people may latch onto different ones. And if you're not highly familiar with this, it does take a little bit of getting your head around. So this is the carbon cycle, and I'm going to claim, with justification, and by the way, I don't say anything that I can't provide references for later if anybody's interested, that livestock, the methane from livestock is not contributing to any global warming at all. And I have support for that from Professor Miles Allen of surprisingly, the Oxford Martin School for the Future of Food, not known for their friendliness to livestock. And the reason for this, there are three explanations for this, but this is the simplest one really. Here is of all what the cow eats, some of it is pooped out, some of it is, we're talking about carbon cycling here, some of it goes off is breathed out as carbon dioxide into the air, and some of it, 1%, comes out as methane. Now, the IPCC, who set the rules for all of this way back, the ones they're actually working from they're called the Instructions for the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory 2006, chapter 4, if you want to know. But they didn't try to put the carbon dioxide from livestock into their calculations because it's part of the carbon cycle. So they knew perfectly well that carbon dioxide has been grown in the grass, is eaten by the cow, and goes out as carbon dioxide and goes back into the grass. But for some reason, and I can't explain why, they decided that the methane, which is 1% of the total carbon cycle of this cow, which goes into the air, they would account for. Their methodology for accounting for it we'll come to in a minute, and in fact that methane, as this diagram shows, has a short life in the atmosphere. It has a 10-year life, and is then either broken down by the hydroxyl radical in the atmosphere, or is chomped by methanotrophic bacteria which live in soil. And in fact, pastures are particularly rich in methanotrophic bacteria. Surprise, surprise, but no one has really done the research yet to find out how significant that is and how much of it gets chomped straight away. That's a simple way of describing that livestock's methane is not new methane. Unlike fossil fuel methane, it's all part of the carbon cycle. The only odd thing about it is that the methane resides in the atmosphere, each molecule, for an average of 10 years. But apart from that, it's all part of the carbon cycle. So you can argue, and many people do, that it should never have been counted at all. So,
sorry, doesn't it also depend on the digestion of the animals? So earlier on, you're talking about the difference between grass and meadow feeding. So if anybody's had a vindaloo curry, you'll know how that affects digestion and methane production in the body. If you're feeding monoculture grasses to cattle, doesn't that also affect possibly different levels of methane production?
There are huge differences, but they are inadequately studied. So there are huge differences from the very few studies that we have. The way the science community has dealt with this is to say the more they've just blanked that out at the moment. you said, we don't have enough information. And the figures given, so I've read the chapter, sadly, in the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, and it actually gives you a choice of 3 different ways to calculate methane emissions from cattle, according to how much information you have. But basically, they're sort of blanket approaches. What they do, however, is they say that pasture-fed cattle are to be accounted at twice as much as grain-fed cattle. Right? That's in the inventory. And they're saying that because they're assuming that pasture-fed cattle grow more slowly. So these are very crude metrics, but they've only made that one distinction. So we who are pasture-fed are being penalised, you might say scientifically justified, because cattle finished, for example, in the CAFOs, the concentrated animal feeding operations that they have in America, are they're fed on grain, which is grown on arable ground, and they are alleged to grow faster and to have therefore less methane per kilogram. Now, that's a big subject actually, but we might touch on that. But it does mean that there has been some justification for people saying, such as George Monbiot, who devastated. He'd always been a supporter of organic farming, and then 2 or 3 years ago, before his appalling book, he wrote an article in the Guardian saying that, don't you middle class organic people think you're saving the world? You're the worst. Organic beef and lamb is the absolute worst. And that was entirely based on the metric that, in fact, all of this is based on this metric that if you have a bovine and it breathes out methane, the slower it grows, the more methane it breathes out, and so on and so on. Now, in fact, we disagree with this fundamentally because we don't think the methane should be counted at all. And I'm just coming on to the real scientist who says the same thing.
Remember, James, we did that paper some time ago, came from France. It said 1 hectare of grass negates the methane from all cattle. So extensive growing cattle.
Thank you. Thank you for introducing me to Susana et al. 2007. No, that's another way. So we'll do that now, in fact. So separately to this, a group of scientists over the last 20 years have been measuring what's called the flux, which is the gas exchanges between a whole ecosystem, within a whole ecosystem. This is incredibly difficult science to do, as you can imagine. They use sort of isotopic tracers and things. I don't really know how they do it actually practically. But they have established, so this is the second of my 3 arguments about methane, they've established that grazing ruminants on pasture, on average, is better than carbon neutral in its entire greenhouse gas exchanges. So that means carbon dioxide leaving, grass growing, fixation of carbon into the soil, and even including methane leaving the site, even including that, grazed cattle are better than carbon neutral. See, what the IPCC did was they said they were just going to look at the cow and its emissions. But if you take the system as a whole, which is the cow and the grass, Geoffrey, you're absolutely spot on. That science is well established, although not often quoted in the literature. It's all available. I can give references to all this. It's available in the literature. It's very rarely referred to by people who want to argue that livestock are destroying the planet. And that is true even though the methane has left. So that's counting as a greenhouse gas emission, even including that. And even though then they weren't allowed to count the fact that they know that methane will break down within 10 years. Even in the immediate situation, they're saying this is better than carbon neutral. Okay? And the third one is from a group of scientists, mostly headed by this Professor Miles Allen, spelled M-Y-L-E-S, at the Oxford Martin School for the Future of Food. And he, have I got, I don't think I have got a slide on that. If you're interested in this, you should read this stuff. What he says is that the IPCC got the accounting of methane wrong right at the beginning. And the reason is this. Carbon dioxide, when you jump in your car and you pop down to the shops, the carbon dioxide that you emit from your car is in the atmosphere forever and ever and ever. And it will be warming the planet in 100 years and 500 years. And even if you reduce carbon dioxide, even if we reduce carbon dioxide emissions, whatever is left will still be warming the planet. Even if we reduce them by 90%, the 10% we're emitting will still be contributing to global warming, which is why we talk about net zero. So we have to get to net zero for carbon dioxide because that carbon dioxide is forever. Methane isn't like that. That, by the way, is called a stop gas. This is all from this professor, and he's written numerous papers about this. Methane isn't like that. It's a flow gas. It goes into the atmosphere and it comes out again. So the methane that cattle, the methane that's in the atmosphere is part of the temperature that the world is. Okay? If you increase it, if you were to increase the methane in the atmosphere, if you were to increase emissions, there would be more methane at any one time. Even though it has a 10-year life, there would be more methane, and that would contribute to global warming. Conversely, if you decrease methane emissions, you get global cooling. So, unlike carbon dioxide, where if you reduce it, the remainder, your emissions will still continue to warm the planet, more and more and more. If you reduce methane emissions, it will actually help to cool the planet, because they're contributing to the temperature the planet actually is at the moment. Now, the IPCC's methodology didn't take that into account. They simply said that methane was a multiple of carbon dioxide. So their methodology doesn't work at all. So the question is methane increasing in the atmosphere? I don't know if you know the answer. It actually is. Methane is measured in a lot of places in large parts of the world, and it actually increased up to about 1996, and then it stopped increasing until 2007. And everyone thought that was great. And since 2007, it's been increasing again quite rapidly, but there is dispute about why it's increasing. So that is contributing to global warming because it's increased. That extra methane will make the planet warmer, even though if you stop putting the methane in, you would then reverse that effect. It would get cooler, unlike carbon dioxide, which will continue to warm it forever. So are cattle, that was my question at the beginning, so methane is increasing. Is it caused by cattle? No. The number of cattle on the planet is declining. The number of livestock on the planet is, the number of livestock is increasing, but the number of ruminants is decreasing. So that's the third reason why we would argue, and professors of climatology at Oxford University argue, that cattle are not actually contributing to global warming. However, if we were to find a way of reducing the methane from cattle, either by reducing their numbers or by feed additives, which are a subject of hot research, and there is a big success with this because there's a seaweed which they found in Australia, which when added in tiny quantities to the cattle's feed reduces their methane emissions by 99%. This was about 5 years ago. It doesn't seem to have gone anywhere because that seaweed is not in production or anything. I don't know where that's going, but one way in which cattle farmers could suddenly, from being the villains of the world, could suddenly become the heroes of the world, is we could all start feeding this some substance which will reduce methane emissions by 99%. That would be fantastic because it would contribute to global warming. But I have to point out that that only buys you time. If your carbon dioxide emissions continue at any level, you will still get global warming. All it does is set you back. It gains you about, if all the cattle on Earth were removed today, it would gain us about 5 years. That's all. So it makes almost no difference. Yes, Jeffrey. And of course, they're only 20% of total global methane emissions anyway. The easy wins are fossil fuels, because they're, and this is basically down to the Chinese and the Russians, both of whom are emitting vast quantities of methane from their fossil fuel extraction, and that's the easy win in methane emissions. Sorry, Jeffrey.
I don't know if pigs start, but the China grows half the whole population of the world's pigs on concrete, and the same as the feedlots in America. That can't be very positive. But going back to the CO2, the greening of Africa has been progressing for the last 30 years, and it's growing and growing and growing because there's lots of carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
So you take the carbon dioxide away, the Africans won't have anything to eat. So
I'm not going to go down that particular. I know this is said. I'm not an expert on that, so I'm not going to talk about it. That may well be true. Okay, right. Sorry, I'm going to be as quick as I can, because that actually is a quote from one of his things, but we won't stop on that. Global land use for food production. I don't really need to refer to this. It was really a prompt. Destruction of habitat. Actually, we'll do destruction of habitat. So, Dr. Marco Springman, senior researcher for the Oxford Martin Programme for the Future of Food, told The Independent, the UK directly imports about 30,000 tonnes of beef from Brazil. As far as I'm concerned, this means when we eat meat, we have deforestation on our plate. Now, it's no surprise to me that this man is at the Oxford Martin Programme on the Future of Food, because they hate livestock. There's no other way of saying it. They spend their whole time writing stuff saying livestock are destroying the planet. I think that this is a classic example of either bias, laziness, ignorance, or sheer stupidity, because it's nonsense. And in an academic, none of those things are acceptable. So, actually, the figure today is about Britain only imports a tiny quantity of the beef that we eat. Actually, only 14,000 tonnes. Not all of that comes from Brazil. It represents about 100 grams per person per year. So a tiny, tiny quantity. And the reason we do that is they have a cannery, and for some reason some people like having corned beef, and we buy that from Brazil. Okay? Now, livestock is a driver of deforestation. Are livestock uniquely responsible for deforestation? We import 3 million tonnes of soya from Brazil. Now, for a long time people have argued that that is being fed to livestock, and therefore that livestock, that we buy soya from Brazil, and that's a driver of deforestation. That may be true. But 60% of the soya we import from Brazil is put into human food. In other words, it goes into plant food, it goes into vegan burgers, and it goes in 60% of all the products on the supermarket shelf that are manufactured have soya in them. So
where's that statistic from?
which one?
The 60% of the soya that we import.
I can find the reference for that.
Okay. Because I know, like, globally 70% of soya is used for livestock feed. That's like a global figure. So I don't know whether it's relevant just for the UK, but in general, 70% of the soya is the livestock.
That may be true. Of what Britain imports, I can tell you one reference to this is an organisation called the Sustainable Food Trust, and they've written an essay on this particular subject. But even if, so I'm not in favour of deforestation. We should do everything we can to prevent deforestation and the loss of habitat all over the planet. But to say that this means when we eat meat we have deforestation on our plate, it's just, I'm sorry I'm going to use the word again, but it's just bollocks. What about my beef? What about pork? What about lamb? What about chicken? Is the fact that the Brazilians are chomping away at the Amazon, does that mean that all the meat on earth is guilty of that deforestation?
Sorry to be devil's advocate, but you could argue that we just deforested many, many hundreds of years ago. And so, you're reaping the benefits of deforestation which occurred by our ancestors, which carried out by our ancestors. Even though I'm supportive generally, what you're saying.
Where are you going with that?
We very easily sort of criticise all these nations that are deforesting, but we've already done it. So.
Yeah, but our gaps are a lot smaller.
Yeah, I mean, Northwest Europe was extensively deforested in the Neolithic and Bronze Age. I mean, we can't, we can't go back and ask those people, did you not know what you were doing?
I just think that was
But would it not be better to bring that back for the planet or for the...
You won't be able to grow crops if it's all
for
forested.
the wildlife, for the environment, the ecosystem?
Sorry, one of my earlier, I know I'll have that, we're going to get drawn into a different conversation, but what we've got in Britain is a lot of grassland. Now, it's been there for thousands of years. You could argue that we lost woodland to get that grassland, but most nature conservationists want to improve the kinds of habitats we have. Now, there's a huge concentration on tree planting. In my view, an overly obsession with tree planting in Britain, which is why charities like Plant Life are saying, we need to look after our grasslands, because they provide a vast range of ecosystem services. So do woodlands, but it doesn't mean you have to translate all the grassland into woodland. I'm just going to go...
And also there is some evidence that the whole concept of a squirrel could go from Cornwall to Scotland without touching the ground actually.
It wasn't like that, and actually whatever you do, it has to be slow. And some places it will be right to make it back to woodland, and other places it just won't.
Yeah. So a huge amount of deforestation in most of the deforestation in Southeast Asia is for palm oil plantations. And palm oil, as far as I'm aware, no fraction of that is used for animal feed. So to say that meat is uniquely guilty of deforestation or habitat change is simply misleading, because a lot of it goes into plant-based food. And to say that all meat is guilty of it is simply ludicrous. It simply doesn't make sense that because the Brazilians are deforesting their land, that all the meat in the world is guilty, shares that guilt by association. That simply doesn't make any sense to me. We could talk about that's more philosophical. We could talk about that. And the last one, because I'm sure you're keen for me to wrap up, is that livestock use too much land. So, and what you read, and it's always said in doom-laden tones by people who are against this, is that 3/4 of all the farmland on earth is used for livestock. This is meant to be a very, very bad thing. My question is, why does that matter? We're used to thinking that that's a bad thing. Why does that matter? What do you want to be done with that land? Yes, Barry.
More land for people to live on the land and have affordable access to land.
Have what?
More land freed up for people to be able to live on it, because land's so expensive and house prices are so expensive and rent because we have so little land available to us. So when things sort of privatised and in these huge farms. So that would be one suggestion, is that it could be, if you've got more land, then people have more access to the land and can use it and can, live from the land in an alternative from what we're...
That raises so many questions that I'm just, I don't think we've got time to deal with it. But I mean, we're building, let's stick on the global context, okay? Before the dawn of humans, about 30% of the world was grassland. Okay? Grassland and herbivores, or grazers of one kind or another, evolved together between 40 and 50 million years ago. Today, about 30% of the world is grassland. when people say, you know, that livestock are using up 3/4 of the world's farmland, it's difficult to see what their point is. We're meant to think this is a very bad idea, but, and this is, we're not talking science here, we're talking sort of logic and reason. It's difficult to see what the point is. We plough 1/9 of the surface of the planet. 1/9 already, 11% of the surface of the planet. Do you want more of it to be ploughed? And by the way, we already produce enough food to feed 16 billion people. Okay, I can reference that as well. So what do you want that grassland? The world's great grasslands, you know, the pampas of South America, the prairies of North America, the steppes of Asia, and you know, the veldt in South Africa. These are all natural grasslands that have been there for millions of years, and they're still there. What is it you want to do with that land? Why do you want to do something other than have grazing animals on it?
Could it be used to spot wildlife, or like the animals that have gone extinct because we've taken that land, raised forests, and maybe bring back some in that forest to support a wider sort of species, you know, like sort of rather than just having so many domestic animals, maybe we could support the wildlife instead.
Yeah.
Would that be?
I think, as a matter of fact, I think that's the only sort of reasonable case that you could make, is that some of that land could go back to being wilder. I mean, a lot of the world is wild. Sorry, one little joke point that I was going to make about this is that we don't complain about all the other things that are using up the world's land. I mean, penguins use up 10% of the world's land. How shocking is that? Mountains use 30%. I mean, that's appalling, isn't it? A lot of the world is quite wild, but it's true that the world's grasslands have actually to a large extent been ploughed, and a lot of the rest has been used for wildlife. And I think there could be some balance. But I would still want it to be grassland. I want it to be wild herbivores, grazers, rather than being put under forestry, for example, or
With population growth and evolution that changed the hunter-gatherer into domesticating animals because so many people need to eat. And, you know, Kenya and all those places are acres and acres and acres and not very many animals, but they live with it and that's their living, because it's how it's evolved.
James?
Yeah.
The statistic about 75% of the land being used for livestock.
Yeah.
They're not just talking about grazing, are they?
No,
Usually,
sorry. I'll answer that now.
when they finish.
Right, I'm going to wrap up in 1 minute, okay, because it's exhausting. So Tash has just said, and this was in my notes, is that of that 3/4 of land, actually the quarter that is under arable, 40% of that goes to feed livestock. Now that is a very bad idea, and that is in my summary. So what I'm saying is, I'm not defending all livestock. I'm not saying all livestock is good livestock any more than all crop husbandry is good crop husbandry. Farming was a very bad idea, but arable farming was particularly disastrous, and industrial and intensive farming even more so. But to say that all livestock husbandry is bad is as ridiculous as saying that all crop husbandry is good. So, which are the lorries and which are the bicycles? Sorry, I have got one more. There we go. So this slide effectively summarises my view of where livestock farming should go, because I'm not defending the whole of livestock farming. I don't know if you can see this, but it's a comparison done by a colleague of mine at the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association. It summarises a lot of information that I could have talked about at much greater length, but there isn't time to. So grassland has biodiversity, it captures carbon, grazing animals have high animal welfare, they mitigate flood and drought, and they produce high quality beef. We haven't talked about nutrition at all, but it's a whole other subject. Grain fed, and this is a pretty dramatic picture, but I mean this is what a lot of the world's arable farming looks like. I mean that's clearly in either the States or Canada. Produces pork, chicken, And beef, of course, a lot of beef is grain fed. Lots of waste slurry and lots of nutrient deficient milk. And those kind of systems have poor biodiversity, water pollution, flooding and climate change emissions, because the grain that's used to feed livestock uses fossil fuels, so that's not part of the carbon cycle. So even though growing arable crops captures a lot of carbon, that's part of the carbon cycle, but in addition to that, they emit lots of greenhouse gas emissions from these machines and from the nitrate fertilizers and so on. So my view is that what we should be doing is immediately ceasing to feed any grain, or any arable crops I should say, grain and soya, to any livestock, which I think was a really, really bad idea, because arable farming is destroying the planet. And we should use that 40% of land that would be released to put grass onto it, to replace the protein we're losing from this. And those figures just about balance out, by the way, because that's relatively high quality land and would be very productive as grazing land.
Isn't that down to cost though? Because I bet you the beef burgers in McDonald's are grain fed.
They probably are. Grass feeding is cheaper actually.
Is it?
But the end product isn't though, is it? That's part of the problem is people's eating habits has become acceptable or a requirement these days for people that eat chicken. They want to eat it 3 or 4 times a week, when in the past the chicken was once a month. Well,
what we've got is this is another talk, and I'm going to offer it in a year's time, because I have 2 subjects I can talk about, which is about land use more generally. What we've got is the globalization of land use. And globalization of land use has produced the largest quantity of food per head of population that we've ever had in the world at the lowest cost. The output of farming is now worth 1/4 in real terms what it was in 1980. So in just 43 years, we're now down to 1/4. The world massively overproduces food. So that food is, by the way, the clearance of forests in Brazil, for example, is supply-led, not demand-pulled, which is another talk. But that has led to a vast supply of extremely cheap food. I know everybody panicked when the Ukraine war came and you couldn't get ships through the Black Sea. That's because of the relatively small amount of grain traded in the world. It's really actually quite small, only about 10% is traded internationally, but 1/3 of that came through the Black Sea. So suddenly a lot of countries that normally would get their grain from the Black Sea couldn't get their grain from the Black Sea. This doesn't mean the world is short of food. The Americans produce enough food to feed about half the world on their own. I can show you the figures, just on their own, and they are desperate to feed more people and make them more fat and more unhealthy and to put more processed food into more products. They're absolutely desperate to shift this food on their own. So one of the ways that they do it, one of the ways that the world has done this, is to feed pigs and poultry and grain and beef with grain. So there is a vast industry growing grain to feed to livestock. That's what's destroying the planet. And that economically, someone raised the economics of this, I can't solve the economics of that. Somehow we have to stop ploughing up, clearing more land and ploughing up more land to produce ever cheaper grain, ever more pointlessly. That's it. And that is just to remind you that my cattle are plant-based.
Thank you, Jane. Did you want to do Q&A? Or you done now?
Sorry?
Did you want to do questions?
I can take questions if there are any, but do feel free to leave if you want to. I'm happy to talk about this.
Could you also ask people to make a donation for Tully for the space and I've got a bowl?
Oh, you could do that.
I could do that.
Yeah.
Before we move on to Q&A, I didn't say this at the beginning, but if people could make a small donation towards the space, I think there might be a bowl. If there's not a bowl, there is a bowl. Just because we need to get Tully some money. Thank you, everyone.
Oh, you didn't get my joke. I had one joke.
Oh, go
So I
on.
was going to say everything.
I won't stop Phil until you've made your joke.
So in the world, the pristine primeval world before man, there were grasslands everywhere, and to maintain grass, you need to have something to manage it, which is either grazers or in the modern world, it's mown. Grassland has to be either cut or grazed. So in New Zealand, where there are no ruminants, and in fact no mammals, actually apart from 2 bats, I think, what was managing the grassland?
Fire.
Mowers. They actually do, they really did. I mean, they're dead now, but they did eat grass. Are there any questions?